Good morning, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This sounds like a fantastic event. I've been looking at the program for the entire event, and it seems like an incredibly high quality event that you have a lot of exciting sessions planned. So thanks again for the invitation. For me, it's always very important to have the opportunity to speak with young people that are engaged in the very sorts of critical issues that you all are. So my name is Gregg Buken-Knapp. I'm a professor at the School of Public Administration at the University of Gothenburg. I'm a specialist in migration and integration policy. It's something that I've been working with for a couple of decades now, and am primarily interested at this moment in the way in which we try to assist individuals who move from one country to another, become settled in such a way that it will benefit their opportunities to develop their lives so that they achieve their fullest potential. In other words, I'm very interested in integration issues. And that's what I'm going to be talking with you about today. I'm going to be beginning by giving you a little bit of background about the Swedish case, about Sweden, in case you don't know much about it in general. I'll also be talking about, for a great extent of the talk, MIPEC's Integration Index, the Migrant Integration Policy Index, which is a standard index used to map integration in 52 different countries around the world. And then I'll be talking about how Sweden scores on it. And it's not going to be a story in which I pat myself on the back and say, wow, Sweden does great and we're done. There's actually a lot of critical reflection here. And then at the end, hopefully there'll be room for questions, comments, discussion, and I'll certainly look forward to speaking with all of you. So a few words about Sweden. What is it that you need to know if you're not familiar with Sweden at all? Sweden is a country in Northern Europe on the West Coast. Here I live in Gothenburg. I live in sort of South Central West Coast Sweden. Sweden is a country with about 10.4 million people as of last year. And our foreign-born population is 20%. So we are very much a country of immigrants. In 2019, the highest percentage of our foreign-born population came from Syria, and that's at 9%. And the second highest was Finland, 5.6%. And I can explain to you that the reason why we have those two countries so high, previously Finland was always the largest percentage of the foreign-born population. And that has a great deal to do with the way in which Finland and Sweden have had this relationship where Sweden took large numbers of labor migrants from Finland in the 1950s who stayed here, and family members came, and there's this continued relationship. Syria, on the other hand, in 2019, it's the first time that Syria is our largest category of foreign-born people. And why is that? Well, that's because, as we all know, that in 2015, there was what is called a refugee crisis, in quotation marks. And as a result of this refugee crisis, large numbers of individuals had to flee very desperate and unsafe conditions and look for safe places throughout other countries. And in one case, of course, Sweden took an enormous amount, initially 160,000 in 2016. Not all of those were unfortunately allowed to stay. But our largest percentage right now of foreign-born population is Syria. So when we talk about migrants who are in Sweden, we're talking about refugees, of course, but we're also talking about mobile EU citizens. Remember that Sweden, as part of the European Union, we have this ability to move freely with our Swedish passport from one EU country to another, just as individuals can move here to Sweden with their own passports. I've done that myself. I've lived in Scotland for several years with my Swedish passport. It's a very common thing to do, and then you either decide to stay or to return home. And then, as we also know, there is the opportunity for people to have visa-free visits to the European Union, and Ukraine is very thankfully among those. Now, when we talk about integration, Because what we're talking about here is refugees. We're talking about mobile EU citizens. We're also talking about labor migrants that come from outside the European Union. We're talking about people in terms of family reunification. Perhaps their spouse came here initially as a refugee, or perhaps their spouse came here as a labor migrant. We're also talking about students. When we talk about integration of these different groups, what is it that we're actually talking about? How do we define this? I mean, think about it. If we were to meet somewhere in a cafe one evening and start talking about integration, we'd both be using the word. But would we really be talking about the same thing? We'd need to come to some sort of understanding about what we mean when we say the word integration. So what I want to propose for you today is an example of one way that we can think about integration. This is not the only way, but it's a very commonly accepted way. And this is what's called the Migration Policy Index, Migration Integration Policy Index, which is just called MIPEX for short. And MIPEX releases a study every year over a large number of indicators, looking at this point, 52 countries across the globe, and ranking them when it comes to issues of integration. Now, remember, it's a big study, 52 countries, multiple indicators, so it's going to give you these snapshots when it compares. In other words, the nuances are sometimes going to be missing. And as we all know, when we think about integration, either as people who are migrants, or as people who work with migrants, or just as people in society who have an interest in building a more inclusive society, we all know that the nuances are what really, really matter. So what are the key indicators that MIPEX looks at? What I want to do is present those to you first, let you know what it is that MIPEX looks at when it decides how to rank a country, and then we'll talk some about Sweden. So one of the first things they look at is what's called labor market mobility. And labor market mobility is the freedom of an individual when she or he is on the labor market to be able to move around and work in different professions, to work in different companies. And this can range from all access, where if I have a residence permit to the country, I can work anywhere. I could work as a baker, I could work as a dentist, I could work in the north of the country, I could work in the south of the country. Or it could be geographically restricted, or it could be restricted by sector. Now, maybe some of you can hear in my voice that I have a certain English accent. I came to Sweden as a migrant over 20 years ago now. And when I came to Sweden, I had very limited labor market mobility. I was only allowed to work in one company in one type of job. I was only allowed to work as a guest researcher at the University of Gothenburg. Initially, I had very limited labor market mobility, which gradually expanded. And now, because I'm Swedish, I could work anywhere. And even if I wasn't Swedish and I had permanent residency, I could work anywhere in Sweden. It wouldn't be a problem. But this is a gradual process in some countries. In other countries, it's automatic right from the beginning. The next indicator that they look at is family reunification options. Think about it. If you decide to move to another country, oftentimes you have other individuals in your lives. You have parents, you have siblings, you may have children, and you want to think about, will they be able to come with me? If I get residency either as a refugee or as a worker or as a student, what about my family? And so MIPEX looks at the conditions under which different family members are allowed to follow with the initial migrant. The next is education. Obviously, one of the cornerstones to having a successfully integrated person in society, regardless of whether she or he is a migrant, is the degree to which they are able to take advantage of educational opportunities provided by that society on an equal footing. If native-born population has free university education, what about migrants? If native-born population has training opportunities once they're adults and they want to switch from one occupation to another, What about migrants? And on and on and on. So you look at the degree to which the population that moves into the country has a similar access to education. Health. Of course, healthcare services, absolutely, very, very, very critical. What we all know is that migrants in general have difficulty accessing healthcare services even when they have the legal access, partly because of language and information campaigns. When they don't have the language background, they don't necessarily know how to access the healthcare service, or they feel that they won't get the proper understanding. So BIPEX looks at, do they provide interpreters in a given country? Do they have targeted information campaigns? Do they have special initiatives for migrants? Think about it. Some people who come as refugees might be suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome. Do you have specific campaigns trying to assist people with those mental health challenges? Then MIPEX looks at political participation. And political participation has to do with the extent to which migrants are allowed to vote. In some countries, migrants who aren't yet citizens have a limited right to vote. Can they run for office? How are they integrated into the decision-making process? And I know for all of you, this idea of being integrated into the decision-making process is absolutely of real importance, because what you're thinking about is how you can have an influence. And for migrants, this is something that's key as well. Then MIPEX looks at permanent residency. That ability to say, I've moved to a country and I get to stay. Not that I show up and I have a permit that says 2 years and you're out, or 1 year and you're out, maximum 48 months and you're out. Do you have the ability to take that limited permit and turn it into a lifetime opportunity to stay in that country if you want to? And that doesn't mean you'll always stay there. As said, in my case, I went and worked in Scotland for a few years. I have many friends who came to Sweden from the Balkans, and what they did is they have Swedish citizenship and they go back and forth between the two countries. Okay, that's another option as well. But if you want to, do you have that ability to stay in the country permanently? Then can you convert permanent residency to actual citizenship? Can you get the passport? Some countries make that very difficult, have a lot of requirements: language, knowledge of the country, number of years, they check criminal records, these sorts of things. Or others say, hey, if you've lived here X number of years, that's all that matters. Different countries, different rules. And then finally, anti-discrimination policies. To what extent do the laws of the country make sure that everyone, regardless of their background, regardless of where they were born, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their faith, regardless of their sexual identity, regardless of any of these things, are they guaranteed equal treatment? And in some countries, migrants are given full access, and in others, they suffer very much from discriminatory behavior. Okay, so those are the things that MIPEX looks at when it ranks these 52 countries every year. How does Sweden score? This isn't me sort of patting myself on the back, but I will say this. Sweden scores #1 out of all 52 countries. It is at the highest on all of these indicators. But what I want to do is to go through these indicators one more time with you. And I want to talk about why MIPEX puts Sweden so high on them. But I also want to highlight for you what it is that MIPEX thinks are shortcomings with Sweden. And I want to highlight for you what I see as some of the shortcomings as well, based on my research. Because I think that we can sometimes get a mistaken belief that just because a country is #1, or just because a country ranks highly, that there aren't significant issues to deal with. And my argument to you would be that that's what makes our situations more similar than you might think. We have a lot of work to do with integration issues. And even if we are technically, according to something like MyPEX at a very, very different place, in reality, it still takes hard work identifying the problems and considering how they can be best met in your local context. So let's take a look at these in terms of Sweden. The picture is not simple. That is the message that you are going to get again and again and again. While Sweden scores highly, in reality, there are question marks that can be raised. Let's begin with labor market mobility. As said, and labor market mobility is the ability of individuals to move around from one employment sector to another, from one part of the country to another geographically. You can tell whenever I talk about Sweden geographically, I go up and down because I think way up at the Arctic Circle and I think down here where it's comparatively warmer. I never think east-west. We're in a very narrow country. We're a long country, so north-south. What we can say, the positive, is that Sweden has strong equal labor protection. If you are legally resident as a migrant, you are covered by the same rules as a native-born Swede. They cannot formally discriminate against you, remember the word formal, formally discriminate against you on the basis of your migrant background. You also get access to the same work-related training opportunities as a native-born Swede. So that means that if you're looking to increase your professional competency and the state provides those opportunities or your employer provides those opportunities, you get access to them as well. And we'll come back to that in terms of education, because I'll give you an example about that when we get to education. However, Sweden has a certain negative, which is still a real challenge. And remember when I talked about my own case, about that limited labor market access for the first couple of years. That is still the case for people who come here from outside the European Union, that they are limited to one sector and one employer. And you might say to yourself, what's the big deal? They've got a job, right? But the problem is, if I have my entire residence permit status dependent on my ability to work at that one company in that one job, how likely am I going to be to raise issues when I think there's a problem at work? How likely am I going to be to ask critical questions, to say, hey, the employer isn't following her or his obligations when it comes to treating me well? I might not do it because I might not want to risk losing my permit. So this is still a real challenge for Sweden. And there's many of us that would like to see this limited permit access removed right away. You come in, maybe you have a temporary permit, but you're allowed to work in any profession, anywhere in the country. So family reunification. What does that situation look like in Sweden? The ability for an individual who comes to Sweden, if she or he wants to bring parents or wants to bring children or wants to bring a spouse to come and live in Sweden as well, can they come along on the basis of that initial migrant's application? We can begin by saying that once families are fully reunited, they have a very secure future in Sweden. If they get admitted as a group, they have safe conditions. So that's a positive. And Sweden scores very highly on that. That there is very limited risk then that those who are admitted as a family and are granted permanent residency, there's really no chance that they can be asked to be removed from Sweden. However, what we do know is that since 2016, as a result in the change in the migration law in Sweden, because of the refugee crisis, in quotation marks, they have implemented a specific procedure or requirement that mandates that if I, as an individual who has come to Sweden, or even if I'm a Swede, which I am, and I wanted to sponsor somebody else coming to Sweden, I have to be able to show that I can pay for that. I have to have a job where I make a certain amount of money. I have to have a certain amount of money in the bank. I have to show, in other words, that this individual that I would like to bring to Sweden would not be a financial burden on the Swedish state. So what's the effect of that? it reduces the number of family members who can come to Sweden, because oftentimes the people who would like to bring their family members are people who are refugees. They get refugee status. They are unfortunately in very low income jobs, if they have a job. They're learning the language. And as a result, they don't make the money that would allow them to qualify to bring their family members. So it prevents families from being together. And we can say in general as well, aside from the financial resources, that the rules have now been changed that really make it much more difficult for an individual to say, I want my adult child to move here, or I would like for my parents to move here. It's still easiest if you want to bring your spouse, but if you want to bring parents or children, that's much, much more difficult. How about access to educational opportunities? Well, the first thing you need to know is that in Sweden, education is free. Universities are free as well. Who are universities free for? Who are they not free for? They're free for anyone who is either a Swedish citizen, has permanent residency in Sweden, or is a citizen of an EU country. So let's say you were a citizen of Germany and you wanted to come study in Sweden, the university would be free. If you were somebody who had permanent residency as a refugee and you wanted to then go to university, it would be free. If you're born in Sweden, you're a Swedish citizen, it's absolutely free. So if you get the permanent residency, then you have access to the Swedish education system. And in addition to that, you get access to student loans, because remember, if you go to university, it's going to take time away from your life. You're not going to be able to be out on the labor market. So you have to pay, you have to pay rent, you have to eat, you have to buy books, you have to do all those things. So you get a loan from the state, plus you get a grant from the state, and you have access to all of that. And that's not something that's limited to young people, that they're right now changing that so that access to those loans and grants are going to be made available for people up to the age of 60. Because obviously at some point in life, you might decide, I don't like my job and I want to go to university and I want to change what I've been studying. I want to learn something new. So you should have the same right as anyone else to get that opportunity. So there's equal access, we say, to all forms of education for people who are legally resident migrants. Individuals, particularly for when we're targeting youth, have mother tongue learning at primary schools, because there are plenty of studies that show that learning is assisted when individuals can learn in their mother tongue. So you don't take an individual, throw her into a classroom and say, okay, you're going to learn math and Swedish if you don't learn any Swedish, if you don't know any Swedish. It won't work. So what you need to do is to say, okay, the child comes from Afghanistan. We need to have a math teacher who speaks Dari or who speaks Pashto. And this is something that Sweden puts a lot of resources into. It's not always easy to solve, because sometimes you'll have one or two children at a school with a language that isn't necessarily easy to cover in terms of the teaching staff, and you have to provide for it online somehow, but it can be done. And then additional targeted measures for individuals as their competency needs require it. Now, on balance, we say Sweden's very good at providing educational opportunities to migrants. One area that I would like to highlight from my own research, where we know it's actually not that good, and it's disappointing not to see MyPECs bring that up, is the quality of Swedish language training. Because, as we know, we move to a new country, we want to participate, we want to learn the language. So we need to get language training. In Sweden, it's provided sort of a Swedish language for immigrants is what it would be called. And it's a course that you can take for free, and it's offered, the state contracts out to different providers. So you go and you sit in this class and you learn basic Swedish. And in my research, particularly dealing with refugees from Syria, one of the things that myself and my colleagues have found is that there's a lot of disappointment with the quality of this education. that you will find people of all different language backgrounds and all different skills thrown into the same language class. So people who might be absolutely illiterate sitting together with those who are fluent in multiple languages. People who work as highly trained professionals sitting together with people who engage in manual labor. So first off, they don't really target the teaching of the Swedish in the way in which they could. Second, what we see is that the teachers, particularly during the early and middle part of the days after 2015 and 2016, weren't always the most qualified. They were struggling to fill the positions. They were filled sometimes with people that, in the eyes of the students, weren't the most qualified. Teachers would come in at the beginning of the day, hand out some exercises to be done, leave, come back at the end of the day and collect those exercises. And this did not actually motivate students to want to learn. I mean, if you think about when you learn, you think about when you go to school, when you go to university, when you go to training, you're looking for a teacher that engages you, that treats you as a human being, that talks to you, that wants to get to know you, and wants to work with how you can best learn, who doesn't just come in and say, here are materials, these are the materials, this is how it's done, there is no room for discussion. I mean, that's not pedagogy. That's just somebody telling you what to do. And that's a definite challenge we find at this point. How about access to healthcare? Well, on the really good side, legal migrants in Sweden, like Swedes, have equal access to healthcare. Excuse me. In general, if you come to Sweden as a legal migrant, so long as your first residence permit is for 366 days, 1 day more than a year, if it's for 366 days, then you get full access to the healthcare system. And if you have difficulty in terms of understanding the doctor, and doctors all speak Swedish and English, so usually there's no problem if you can speak English, but lots of people don't. So if you can't speak English, of course, then the healthcare center will arrange for an interpreter to be present during your appointment so that you can discuss the issues that are of concern to you. And that's a really important thing, because going to see a doctor, that's a very personal and difficult experience, to be able to explain what it is that either it feels wrong about your body, or perhaps you feel that you are having some psychological challenges. As said, many people have long-term stress issues who come as migrants, and you want to be able to explain that to a healthcare professional so that she or he can be of assistance. And to do that, if you don't have the language skills, that's really, really tough. However, on the negative side, what happens to people who are rejected asylum seekers? This, I would argue, is a fantastic problem. We have people in Sweden who apply for asylum and get turned down, haven't yet left the country. They begin to lose access to some of the formal documentation that allows them to get follow-up care. And that is definitely not good policy in terms of public health. We know also that individuals who are in Sweden present who are not legal migrants, but come here as undocumented migrants, they have no legal status here, they only get limited health care. They get healthcare access for emergencies only. So they don't get that long-term preventative care to allow them to live healthy and safe lives, which is also an area that Sweden could definitely be improving upon. Political participation, something you're all very, very interested in. We think about the way in which we can take part in society, the way in which we can make our views known, the way in which we can try to choose our policymakers, the way in which we might even decide that we want to be a policymaker. What's the situation like for migrants in Sweden? Well, if you're a non-EU citizen and you've been in Sweden for at least 3 years, legally, you can vote, and you can even run for office at the local level. In fact, when I go to vote every 4 years, And it's you vote for both the local, the county, and the parliament at the same time. You get 3 different ballots, and you'll see people in line, and some of them have all 3 ballots, like me. But then you'll see some people in line that just have 1 or 2 of the ballots because, well, they've only been here for 3 years. But you still give those individuals who have been here for a period of time that opportunity to take part in expressing their opinion about how Swedish society should be run. Of course, if you're an EU citizen, then you have access upon registration to vote in the local elections. You can even run in the local elections, I'm pretty sure, and you get to vote in the EU parliamentary elections. The state provides substantial funding to different immigrant associations. In Sweden, it's very popular for different communities of immigrants to work together, form organizations to try to lobby the state to get policies that they would like to see implemented, adopted. And the state understands that to do this, it takes money to try to persuade the state. It takes time. You need an office. You need to pay the bills. You need to pay some staff. And where does this money come from? It's not just going to fall from the sky. So if you want to help individuals talk to the state about their needs, the state has to give them the money to do that, obviously. And Sweden is very, very generous in that regard. On the other hand, while the state provides this money for these organizations, Sweden doesn't have anything, I guess you would say, along the lines of a sort of an immigrant council. It doesn't have a formal channel for communication between states and migrant communities. So organizations can try to approach the state, but it's not as if there's a guarantee that you get to sit down and have this conversation with the state and talk about what it is that's important to your community. So I'd say that's a very, very minor shortcoming, but it is still a shortcoming. Then, when we think about permanent residency, after 4 years, in most cases, you're able to get permanent residency, assuming that you've been legally resident. It can vary in some cases depending upon the type of migrant, but in general, we can just say 4 years, which is really good. However, right now, our big challenge, and what's in the news almost every day in Sweden, is what we're going to do about refugee minors. Children who came to Sweden under the age of 18 after 2015, chiefly from Syria. They came here without their mom, they came here without their dad. They're here on their own. Under the rules that were adopted, they were allegedly only supposed to get temporary permits. Increasingly in Swedish society, there are voices saying that this is inhumane, that this is ridiculous. These were people who came as children. They deserve to build their lives in Sweden. This is an issue that is not yet settled. The government itself, on some level, is still divided on this. There are parts of the government that are very much in favor of trying to find a way to give them permanent residency. In fact, we just saw that because of the pandemic, for these individuals who have been in Sweden as children unaccompanied, they will be given up to 1 year to find full-time work when they're done with high school. And if they can find full-time work within 1 year, then they'll get to stay. Previously, it had been 6 months. And then there are others who say, you know, really what we're talking about here are, you know, the leaving these children vulnerable to finding employment when they finish high school. Wouldn't it just make much more sense and be much easier just to let them stay? We could benefit from their presence. That's not settled yet. That debate is not settled yet. And then, of course, becoming a Swedish citizen. 5 years of legal residence, again, is the common rule. It can be less in certain cases if you come from one of the Nordic countries. Sometimes it can take a little more because you might have to, it might take a couple of years until you get permanent residency. So in some cases, it can take up to 7 years, but the general rule is 5 years and you become a citizen. However, the waiting time is really long. I can tell you that when I became a Swedish citizen, the waiting time was 9 days. You sent in your material, 9 days later, 9 days later, I had this certificate saying I was Swedish. Wow. You turn in your application now, you're looking at 36 months. And during those 36 months, I mean, that's a lot of uncertainty to know what's going to happen. And think about what that means for an individual. Even if you know you fulfilled the criteria to become a citizen, and if that decision is important to you to get that document, imagine spending 36 months in that type of uncertainty. That is not at all good for an individual's psychological well-being. More resources need to be put into evaluating those applications quicker. This is not the fault of the bureaucrats at the migration agency. They are overworked. They are fantastically overworked. They need more resources. They need more funding. That's the issue there. This isn't a case of people sitting and saying, I'm going to take my time, I'm going to go on a coffee break. There's just not enough staff to do really critically important work. And then finally, anti-discrimination legislation in Sweden. The formal laws provide strong protection, and I had said earlier that we would come back to the word formal. The formal laws are very, very, very strong. That if you take a look at on paper, in Sweden, we provide fantastic guarantees that regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your faith background, regardless of your gender, you will get equal treatment, regardless of your national origin. However, what we know in reality is that it's a much more complex situation. What we know is that it is difficult for individuals who come from countries, particularly non-European countries, to get access to the labor market because there is discrimination. People don't really know what to do with them. Swedes, I always say that this way, Swedes, we're wonderful people. We don't always know how to deal with outsiders. We like people who are, we say we like people who are all sorts of people. We say we like different people. In reality, we're most comfortable with people who are just like us. So when somebody shows up who doesn't behave in the way we do, what do you do in Sweden? 10 a.m., 3 p.m., you take a coffee break, you eat a piece of pastry, and you talk to your coworkers. What happens if you don't have that culture, that 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. coffee break? People actually say, well, what will we do if this person doesn't understand to take a coffee break at 10 and 3? How will we work with her? How will we work with him? What do we do with somebody who wears a headscarf, who looks different than we do? We're a very secular society. Sweden is one of the most secular societies in the world. Religion is almost invisible in the public sphere here. Many of the people who've come to Sweden, particularly since 2015, are actually quite religious, Muslim and also Christian. That presents real challenges for a society that doesn't talk about faith openly. People don't know what to do with that. So the reality is that it's much more complex. And then sometimes it can be downright racist discriminatory, where we have plenty of anecdotal evidence of people who apply for jobs, who have names that aren't traditionally Swedish, and get turned down again and again and again and again. Can show you hundreds of rejection letters. And this has led to a debate, well, should we have job applications where you don't list the name, where you just are, where you're anonymous, so that you can't turn down a person who has a non-Swedish name. You can't find that cue, because we need to find a way to counteract the mental bias of employers that think that somebody may not be able to contribute to the company simply because their skin color is different, or because they practice religion, they come from another country, or they have a different set of values. When at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is, do they know how to do the job, or can they learn how to do the job? So the situation is more complex. We don't have good answers to that yet. We really don't, I think. Is there an overall conclusion here? I want to make sure that we have almost 45 minutes. If you have that many questions, maybe you have less, but I want to make sure that we have a lot of time to talk. So is there an overall conclusion to what I've said here? I actually think that there is. The first thought is that MIPEX, this Migration Integration Policy Index, provides us with good categories. It gives us things to think about. If we go back to my initial point that we're out in the evening, we're sitting in a cafe and we start talking about integration, one of the first things we can do is say, well, what do we mean by integration? And suddenly we can realize that what we're talking about is labor market access. We're talking about access to education, access to healthcare, political participation. We're talking about permanent residency, access to nationality, anti-discrimination, all of these things. It gives us something to talk about. It allows me to say to you, hey, what's it like when it comes to getting citizenship in Ukraine? What's it like when it comes to educational opportunities in your country? What's it like when it comes to political participation in your country? I have that ability to identify specific things so that integration as a big term suddenly has content. Countries can be compared. We can begin to say, oh, hey, Sweden does good on this. How about your country? Maybe your country does better than Sweden on this. Maybe your country doesn't do as well. Maybe we do worse on this or that. But we can pick out these specific indicators and say, well, let's talk right now about education. Let's talk right now about labor market mobility and see how our respective countries do. However, which I think is so emphatically important, nuances wind up being hidden. If you go and look at MIPEX, and MIPEX is a website where you can go and find this data for 52 countries. Ukraine is one of the countries. And what you can go there is you can pick the countries you want to, you can pick the indicators you want to, and then you hit a button and it gives you a PDF report of the whole thing. It's as simple as that. But these are big aggregate stories. And as we know, the challenges of integration in a society are hidden inside of those big indicators. It's really not enough to say a country is good on labor market mobility. The country is one of the best when it comes to education. Yeah, maybe that's the case. But inside those nuances, that's where we begin to find the details. That's where we begin to find where the challenges still are. And that's where we find why no society at all should ever rest on its laurels. No society should look at MIPEX and say, we're doing a great job. If anything, they should look at MIPEX and say, where do we still have more work to do? Where are the problems hidden in these indicators? How do we go about finding out where we need to improve? Constant self-criticism to improve and to make the lives of these individuals better. It's absolutely essential. I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to give you the opportunity here to ask all of the questions you want, to come with all of the comments that you have. There, you can see my email address. So if you want to at some point send me an email and ask follow-up questions as well, you can definitely do that. But we've got a little around 45 minutes. So why don't we talk some if you want to? Sound good? I'm switching back to the gallery so I can see all of you. There.
Діано, я бачу підняту руку. Будь ласка, вмикайте мікрофон і ставте свої запитання.
Дякую. I would like to ask how are the refugees settled in Sweden? So I know that there is an issue of isolation, like from the local population, that I think it is a big problem. It is sometimes a problem for IDPs in Ukraine, and I would like to hear how do Sweden people deal with that.
Thanks for that question, Diana. That's a really important issue, I would say. That what we find when it comes to settling refugees, what Diana's talking about is when people arrive, to what extent, even in their physical housing and where we put those communities, to what extent do we think about the placement of those communities and the structure of those communities so that they get access to the broader society? You can build a fantastic refugee settlement location that gives them everything they need. You could have something where there's a school, where there's a library, but if you put it in a place where there's no bus stop, and if you put it in a place where it's far away from town, then guess what? You're not allowing people to begin to have access to the local community. Obviously, all societies have a problem with something that's called in English NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. People don't always like to see these settlements in their backyards. But if you're really serious about integration of either internally displaced peoples or refugees, you need to make sure that these settlements are located in places where the individuals have easy access to go and work, where they have easy access to go to schools, where they have easy access to go out and just be part of the broader society on their own. So yeah, Diana, that's a really important question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Answer.
Any other comments, questions?
Дякую. Я бачу, що є піднята рука. Катерина Михайлова, будь ласка, вам слово.
Good afternoon, and thank you for a very interesting lecture. And I want to just to tell about my personal experience. I thought you said that Sweden is very successful in integrating refugees and migrants. There are still, for instance, some ghettos inside of the towns. Like when I was in Malmo, I heard like from my friends, like, no, better you don't go to this district during this time, because, well, it's safe, but
That's a really, I mean, yeah, I think first off, Katie, thanks so much for that question. Thanks so much for that comment. And what Katie's talking about is when we think of larger cities in Sweden, there tend to be areas where migrants are settled, and they tend to be oftentimes on the outskirts in certain housing communities. And there's a perception that these areas aren't necessarily as safe as anywhere else. And what we find in Sweden is that the correlation between an unsafe area and a specific location, sort of incidence of crime in a location, isn't necessarily the immigration background. It's the degree to which there's economic uncertainty in the area. So it doesn't have to do with the person's skin color or what country they come from. What we see again and again and again in Sweden is if you're in communities where there's low wages, high unemployment, you potentially, you know, we know that sometimes those aren't the shall we say, the most well integrated areas into society as a whole. And that's not really a function of the person's skin color or what country they come from. That's a function of the lack of economic opportunities. I want to follow up on this point that Kati made, because there's a story I remember from interviews we did for a book that I published last year with Syrian refugees. And one of the refugees talked about that even when she would meet with people who represent organizations in Swedish society that wanted to be of assistance, that they thought the way that Kati's friends did. So even like the people who want to help, they would say, hey, we're going to come out to your community tonight to have a meeting. Is it okay if we come after dark? Is it safe to come there after dark? And they would think, this is incredible. You know, you're the people who are supposed to be on our side, and you're asking the questions like this. You know, you should know better. You should know that the situation doesn't have to do with the refugees being settled here. You should know that if you were to go to any community in Sweden with high economic challenges, there's potential risks. That's a really great point, Kati. Thank you so much. Other comments, questions?
Я поки що не бачу піднятих рук, тож дозволю собі задати запитання від себе. Грег, скажіть, будь ласка, чи є між біженцями певна конкуренція за ресурси, і що держава робить для того, щоб підтримати їх потребу, ну, наприклад, в пошуку роботи чи житла з метою інтеграції? Дякую.
I see two other hands up. I don't know if it's people who want to ask questions. I see that Bogdan has a hand up, and I see that Maria has a hand up, but I'm not sure if they intend to ask questions. If they'd like to ask questions, please go right ahead. If anyone else would like to ask a question, go right ahead. Or else I'll start.
I had a question. Sorry. Lera,
Go ahead.
repeat the question?
Я думаю, що в нас вже є підняті руки, тому ми можемо перейти, наприклад, до запитання від Богдана і далі до запитання від Марії. Дякую, Богдане, вам слово. Богдан Садовий, будь ласка, увімкніть мікрофон для того, щоб поставити запитання.
The classic problem of the pandemic.
Да, я на місці. Да. Дуже цікава була інформація. Чутно мене?
Так.
Чутно. Добрий день усім ще раз. Дуже цікава інформація була з приводу навчальних закладів. І питання по поводу вищих навчальних закладів. Якщо вже здобуто якийсь певний рівень освіти в українських вищих навчальних закладах, чи ратифікуються вони, якщо, наприклад, поїхати у Швецію на навчання, і чи можна здобути підвищення класифікації, або все ж таки прийдеться навчатися заново на курсах в університеті, як іммігранту?
Unfortunately, I'm going to need a translation. I apologize. I don't know how to be on the English channel.
Greg, in order to turn on the translation, you should click on the lower panel.
I am now on the English channel. How about that? So I can hear you. Okay. Okay. First off, Bogdan, I'm sorry that I couldn't immediately understand your question. I apologize for that. But number two, this is a really good point. If I've got a degree from a country outside the European Union and I come to Sweden, what's the situation? Do I have to start over? No. What we have in Sweden is a special organization that certifies your educational degrees. So what you do is you submit all of your educational qualifications to this organization, they review them, and then they tell you what the Swedish equivalent is. I haven't looked at the website in a couple of years, but I used to look at it quite frequently. And one of the things I remember that you could do is you could even look up whether individuals had previously applied with your type of degree. So let's say you had a master's in biochemistry from Taras Shevchenko or somewhere like that. You could look up, has anyone applied with a master's in biochemistry from Taras Shevchenko? And then you would see yes, and it is considered this in Sweden. So this is something that you can absolutely, definitely do. It is the website, you should be able to do this through uhr.se, uhr.se. And Bogdan, if you're looking, yes, I will send that chat to, I'm trying to find everyone. There we go, bing. Bing, there you go.
Дякую за відповідь. Прошу тоді пані Марію.
Good afternoon. First, I'd like to share the experience of our city. So my city, Zoom, was one of the city for first wave of accepting displaced person. So my question, I would like to ask you about situation how displaced persons are involved in the life of the city and in the development project.
I mean, you know, the question of displaced people is obviously going to vary from society to society. One of the key ways that Sweden and Ukraine differ is we don't have internally displaced peoples, obviously. Our experience is that we know about displacement. Sweden does a lot of work in trying to assist individuals in displaced settings, such as in Georgia, such as in Ukraine, such as in Africa, such as in Southeast Asia, with trying to provide them with the resources so that they can take ownership of the issue themselves. And there I really want to be emphatic that the way in which these issues are addressed, of course, you should build networks, international networks, find expertise, find people who have been dealing with these issues, try to learn from them, gain access to money, gain access to facilitators, all of these things. But at the end of the day, you yourselves will be able to develop what you see as the most appropriate way to address the problems you identify. It is never for somebody like me to come from the outside and say, you need to do this, you need to prioritize this first, and you need to work with it in a certain way. You are the ones who on a day-to-day basis address these issues. You know what issues you would like to move up the agenda. The question then is simply, how do you find the creative tools and the resources to address them? But it's a really, really important question. And thanks so much, Daria.
Дякую. І запрошую до слова Дар'ю Децькою.
Доброго дня, дякую за дуже змістовну інформацію. Хотіла задати таке питання. Якщо Швейцарія зараз Швеція зараз знаходиться на першому місці згідно тих індексів, який був цей шлях до цього місця і які перепони стикалась країна? Дякую.
Well, first thing I would say, it's a great question. So Sweden's in first place. And I think what's behind Daria's question is this something that we've consciously done collectively? Is this something that Swedish society wakes up at 9 a.m. one morning and says, okay, it's 12 months to go until the next MyPEX. Let's make sure we're number one. I don't think most Swedes have ever heard of MyPEX. I don't think that most Swedish bureaucrats have ever heard of MyPEX. This is just something that's out there. It's used by migration scholars and people who are interested in migration. But if I were to go and get in touch with the city of Gothenburg and say, hey, you guys are doing great in MyPEX, they'd look at me and they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. What happens here really, I'd say, is it's a function of a lot of small things that sometimes have to do with issues that are much bigger than migration. The countries that tend to score well on MyPEX are also the ones that have the most comprehensive, universal social policies for all individuals, regardless of whether or not they're migrants. So we tend to say that those that do really well oftentimes have more inclusive welfare states, greater access to education, greater labor market training, all of these different things, and they don't put a border inside the country between migrants and others. And that's one of the key things. So I always tell people who say, how do you increase migrant integration? I say, well, one of the things that you obviously need to be doing is taking a look at your social policies overall. What do your labor market policies look like? How do you treat women in society? How do you treat other minorities in society? How do you treat all different groups? What access to education is there? What does healthcare look like? What do retirement benefits look like? All of these things. And as you go about trying to create more inclusive, expansive policies, you make sure that migrants are included in these. Now I get it, trust me. I get that different countries have different financial situations, but I always think that you have to make decisions about where do you want to put your emphasis, where do you want to prioritize. And if you can't do everything at once and you can't remake your society, then you need to say, what are one of the ways that we could bring about the biggest changes for these affected individuals for the least amount of cash? And you sit there and you puzzle it out with your colleagues and think, how do we improve people's lives in a way that isn't going to cost the state too much money? And if we can do that, let's go for that. And then we go for the next thing on the list. And you keep pushing. Thanks, Daria. Great question.
Дякую. Я запрошую Руслана Сатова.
Hi, Greg. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Ruslan.
So Sweden is currently a top 1 European country for having Syrian refugees, right? Presumably, the majority of these refugees are Muslims, yes?
Not necessarily. Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah, sure.
This is a misconception that it is largely Muslims. That remember, Syrians have two large religious denominations, Muslim and also Orthodox Christian. And so what Sweden is seeing is the influx of individuals who are both Muslim and Orthodox Christian, both of which are faiths that Sweden doesn't necessarily know how to integrate quite well. Orthodox Christianity is very, very uncommon here as well, with the exception of sort of the Greeks and the Serbians. So the arrival of, and also the Ethiopians. So now the arrival of the Syrian Orthodox Church presents a definite challenge as well. Go ahead, keep going.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to cut you off. I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, right. So the question is how the Swedish government tries to tackle or probably decrease the level of probably Islamophobia or phobias of other religions across the native society.
Ruslan, that's where your question is so good. One of the reasons I like your question so much is this is a question that we should have been asking of the Swedish government back in 2015. In 2015, I was working on a project in Minsk, in Belarus, right as the refugee crisis began. And I had the opportunity at that time to work with a trainer who was much more senior than I was, that had sort of decades of experience in the Swedish government. And he told me one night over dinner, right as the refugee crisis was beginning, that we're missing an opportunity. The Swedish state is missing an important opportunity here. And that is, we have one of the world's most well-developed public broadcasting systems. And what we ought to be doing right now on television is, as opposed to just showing images of conflict in Syria and people traveling from there to here, we should be producing programs that explain Syrian culture, Syrian values. We should be talking about language. And as opposed to simply saying to people who arrive as refugees, it's time for you to learn about Syria, we should have been getting the Swedish population ready for their arrival so they would understand more about them. So if you ask me what is done, well, Sweden has very broad, I guess you would say, policies that try to tackle racism. Are they sufficiently targeted? No. What Sweden should do next time, let's focus on how we can maybe get it right next time, because I don't think we got it right this time. What we need to do next time is to realize we have an opportunity to educate our own people. We have a responsibility to learn about the people who come to us as well, because at the end of the day, in a few years, they're going to become part of our fabric, and we need to understand them as well. I really appreciate that question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I just asked this question because apparently Britain and France have the same issue.
This is a chronic challenge we've seen, and there's a great book which you should be able to find somewhere online. If you read French, it's originally in French, but it's also translated into English. And the book is called A Small City in France. And it's about a town outside of Paris in the 1980s which had a large number of labor migrants from Northern Africa, and the way in which they weren't integrated into this French community, and how far-right populist parties capitalized on this. And it really, it addresses the issue of how things can go wrong and what we need to think of in order to get them to go right. It's a, and you know, it's got to be available somewhere online or somewhere.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Дякую. Я передаю слово Соломії, і наступний буде Олександр.
So thanks, and to continue this discussion, I would like to ask if now everyone there is ready to welcome refugees, and or that is still a question for the society to accept them here.
This is thanks, Solomia. That's an interesting question, because it allows me to talk about the way some of the political dynamics in Sweden that we have right now, and also how things have changed over time. First, let's go back to 2015 itself. When the quote-unquote crisis began, what we saw at that point were all sorts of large rallies in the city of Gothenburg, in the city of Malmö, in the city of Stockholm, and people would fill the squares with these signs that say, "Refugees welcome." And this was very consistent with this Swedish self-understanding that we believe in international solidarity, and we're tolerant, and on and on and on and on and on. And then the numbers of individuals began increasing, and even the political party that had previously said that there's no reason to think about limits began talking about limits. And that's when everything changed. When the Social Democrats, the center-left party, that had been out of power, but then became in the government. When they were out of power, they criticized anyone for talking about limits, saying Sweden is a rich country, it has a sort of gigantic national budget, it can afford to take, you know, as many as who show up, we never need to think of numbers, suddenly began saying, we don't have the ability. We need to have a pause, we need to have stricter conditions. And we saw these stricter conditions. Sweden went from incredibly generous policies for Syrians to very, very strict policies. And all of these demonstrations faded away, the mass demonstrations. Now, does that mean that there wasn't still civic engagement? No. Lots of organizations emerged during the 2015-2016 period. And what they did was develop all sorts of initiatives to try to work with people to make them feel welcome. And I can list some of them. One of them has to do with providing adult friends to refugee minors. If you think about refugee minors, you know, when they come to Sweden, they get a lawyer appointed to them, they get someone to handle their economic issues, but they don't have anyone just to hang out and talk with. And they, you know, sometimes, you know, you just need a break from all of that stuff and you just want to, you know, maybe go bowling with someone or watch a movie or have dinner at someone's houses. And all sorts of organizations started up to just try to provide that, to be, you know, to be sort of like a second family to these kids, which is really important. So you have that. And then you have all sorts of organizations that started weekend or after school activities so that kids who came from refugee backgrounds would be able to get, you know, go and play football, would be able to go and do ice hockey, which is an important but expensive sport in Sweden. All of these sorts of things provide opportunities, just language cafes where people could go and sit and try to learn some Swedish informally, but get to know people as well. Initiatives to help individuals with their homework. Because kids, you know, sometimes they're sitting in these classrooms and they can't always understand what's going on. So there were things like that. So there was a lot of good stuff, even though the large protests died away. But the other point here that we get in Salomia's question is, is it everyone in Swedish society who thinks this way in terms of positive terms? And the answer is absolutely not. That what Sweden has right now is its third largest political party is a party called the Sweden Democrats. And the Sweden Democrats are a far-right populist party that is anti-immigrant, believes in this, this idea sort of that there's something culturally Swedish, that you can find like this essence of what Sweden is. And if you're not that, you're somehow not Swedish. And that's another reason you should read this book, A Small City in France, because the author of it actually attacks in really great ways this idea that there's such a thing as this is the culture and the culture has always been this. She shows how the French culture just keeps changing over time and changes. We think France is this, then we think France is this, then we think France is this. And this is a problem we tend to find oftentimes with these far right parties that have roots in Nazism, by and large. We all know that that 20, 30 million people died fighting this idea that some people are ethnically better than others and that you can't mix peoples together. And it's just as important to continue fighting that in its different form. But they get around, I think, 17% of the population supports them at this point. They very openly say that they no longer have their Nazi roots, that they're a mainstream political party. They welcome immigrants so long as the immigrants learn Swedish and adopt Swedish values. So what Swedish values are, I have no idea. By the way, I should point out, in Sweden, to become a citizen here, you don't have to take a language test. So you don't have to prove you speak Swedish, and you don't have to take a test to know anything about Swedish society. So, right. So, basically, you could not speak a word of Swedish, and, that's not what's considered important. However, that is likely to change, partly as a pressure now of the far right parties. They are the ones who are pushing this. Does that answer your question, Solomia? Yeah?
Yes, thanks. And one more question.
Sure.
Is there any special non-discrimination law just for those people?
Well, we have, in general, our discrimination law does focus on does say that national origin is a category that you cannot discriminate on the basis of. So it certainly can be used to deal with this type of racism having to do with migration. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, questions? We've still got 18 minutes and I've got half a cup of coffee, so I am ready to
Yes.
talking.
Добрый день, Грег. Я учусь в Донецком юридическом институте, который является высшим переселенцем, и вообще моя будущая специальность полицейский следователь. И вообще у меня к вам два вопроса, но первый меня очень интересует, есть ли у шведской полиции какое-нибудь предвзятое отношение к иммигрантам?
Okay, so so I'll answer that one, then it sounds like you've got a follow-up. One of the things, it's a great question, because obviously when we think about what police are, at the end of the day, they are street level bureaucrats. They represent the state. They're supposed to represent the state in an impartial way. They're supposed to apply the laws and the rules to all individuals the same way, regardless of whether that individual is a woman or a man, is Christian, atheist, Muslim, what have you, on and on and on and on and on, regardless of what country they come from. What we do know in most countries is that people, in terms of being a bureaucrat, do not always exclude their biases when they do their job. That street level bureaucrats will have certain values that they bring with them to work. It is impossible for a street level bureaucrat always to be a robot and just turn those off. The important thing is to be aware you have them and to try to not let them have an impact on you. Now, I haven't seen any study that suggests that there is any type of systematic problem among Swedish police in terms of racism. Point blank, I will say that. What I also know is that when it comes to Swedish police, there is an enormous amount of effort each year on trying to recruit underrepresented communities to the Swedish police. Why? Most likely not because they believe there's an issue with the mindset of the police, but more because you want to increase the sense of safety and security and community in certain areas where people feel like the police don't look like me. The police aren't me. So there's a real effort to try to recruit people who are from migrant backgrounds and to get them to attend the police college programs. And I think that's an important initiative, because at the end of the day, when we talk about community policing, and we talk about community policing, if you think of sort of problems that we've seen in France, in sort of the northern suburbs, if we think of problems we see in areas in the United States, and even challenges that we see in places like Sweden, it's very important that people feel like that the police are on their side and that the police is not an occupying army from the outside there to impose order. And that's not something that can be ignored. So that was question number one, right? There's going to be question number two. Go ahead.
Как бы я хотел спросить конкретно миграция сирийцев. Возможно ли такое, что у работодателей было непредвзятое отношение к ним, просто поскольку они эмигрировали, и, скорее всего, им это надо было делать очень быстро, то есть не было возможности собрать все вещи, документы и так далее. И даже люди, которые имеют какую-то конкретную специализацию, они приходили, но нету данных об их опыте работы, то есть нету как такового резюме. Возможно ли, что из-за этого осложнения працевлаштування?
I think that's a really, what I like about that question is it highlights what is it that it takes to get to the interview. To get to the interview in Sweden, you would need to have all of those qualifications in place. You would need to have a CV that would be considered acceptable Swedish format. You would need to have sort of the educational qualifications detailed in a satisfactory way to be interviewed. Remember, a very small number of people will ever wind up being interviewed for any one position in Sweden. A short list oftentimes of 5 or 7 or something like that, and then there'll be multiple interviews for the final few. To make it to that 5, to make it to that 7, your CV has to be in an acceptable format. You've got to be able to document your education. You've got to be able to document your previous experience. You've got to have your references, all of those things. Then it's the people who make it to the interviews. So maybe the question that Alexander is asking us here is perhaps they don't have their paperwork in order to be able to actually apply. Is that the problem, which may not have anything to do with racism? And there I would say it is difficult for individuals to apply early on when they haven't been able to document their experience in a way that's satisfactory to Swedish standards. And there's a challenge. And so it's one thing really, when we think about individuals who show up, we need to figure out how do we provide as a society some, what is for us, acceptable way to say they have this level of education, they have this level of working experience. I mean, that's something we need to spend more time with, particularly when it comes to labor market officials. They need to be able to address this and think of ways to say, aha, here are commonly acceptable ways that we could implement so as to make this case. Thank you.
Can I please ask a question? I wanted to ask about illegal immigrations. How does this, were there any illegal immigrations, and how does Swedish government control illegal immigrations? And is there a strict policy of immigrations?
What you have in Sweden is you can either be in Sweden, you can be in Sweden legally, or you can be in Sweden undocumented. So we use slightly different terms. What you call illegal, I call undocumented. That there are people in Sweden who are present without the proper paperwork because they haven't had the opportunity to regularize their status. Are there people who are in Sweden without the proper paperwork? Yes. Do we ever know the exact amount? No, because it's difficult to go out and count people who aren't registered. We know they exist. We know that they come from all walks of lives, and that they come from all different countries, both in and outside the European Union. Some arrive from within the European Union, do not have what would be perceived as the ability to get legal employment, and are not given a registration number, but they choose to stay anyway. Others overstay their visas. Others get turned down for asylum and decide that they want to take their chances, and they go into hiding as opposed to leave the country. Swedish police, of course, like police in any country, devote resources to trying to find these individuals so that they can be deported.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bajena. Still got 10.
Я бачу, що Соломія підняла першу і далі Кеті.
Okay. Can I ask? Yeah. I would like to know if raising of crime just a stereotype or a reality in such countries.
Could you repeat the question? I didn't hear the first part.
Sorry. Yeah. If raising of crime is just a stereotype or a reality.
I'm not sure I understand. Could we, if what of a crime?
A raise. I mean the increase.
Sorry, it's me. I don't follow the question.
Okay.
Is there a correlation between an increase in crime and what?
Is just a stereotype. I mean.
Okay, so an increase. So great. There's this common argument. Thanks so much for that. There's this argument that what we see is an increase in crime as a result of increased immigration. No, the data does not support that at all in the Swedish case. It's just, again and again and again, people spend a lot of time playing with the statistics to try to get it to show that, and the data simply doesn't support that. It's not the case.
Okay, I understand. Thanks.
There was before, I know that it looks like, I don't know if it's Katie that has her hand up or whether she just left it up, but let me just say there's a question in the chat right now that says, I love big questions like this. Can you tell me the literature that shows problems and solutions associated with immigration? Well, thank you for that question from 0892020. I will say this as the answer. There is countless books and articles about that. I'm trying to think what I could do is maybe provide Olga a reading list from one of my courses that I teach, and that information could be shared. Actually, if you want to, I don't mean to promote my own book, but I'll promote my own book. And I'll share a copy with you, so don't worry. I can get a copy to Olga. I had a book that came out with 2 colleagues last year. And we wrote a book comparing the experiences of refugees who came from Bosnia-Herzegovina several decades ago with the experiences of refugees who come from Syria, and the way in which they describe their experiences of what it was like to come to Sweden and try to be integrated into Sweden. And it's a really thoughtful book, in my opinion, because what we show is that even over a couple of decades, people still talk about many of the same things. And so the question really is, what has Sweden learned? That we're still making some of the same mistakes, even with very, very different groups. So what I'll do is I'll share that with Olga, and then I assume you have some sort of, that you have a place where you're all sharing documentation with one another throughout the week. So she's welcome to share that with you. Okay. Okay, so now I guess it looks like we've got Katie, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I've got actually so many questions, but I just
Hold on, let me ask you a question. Katie, what do you do for a living?
What I do for a living?
Yeah.
Right now I finished my university and I'm applying for my master. Actually, I applied in Linköping and in in Malmö as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you've applied. Okay, so you've applied Linköping, Malmö, and you do. And does and Olga knows where I'm going with this question, so she can tell what I'm thinking already. Katie, do you do any? Do you work right now for any civil society organization?
Right now, no.
No.
Because I changed my place of living. Like I came from Austria. I came back to Ukraine, so I'm now in a.
Well, let me, there's something I'll talk about for all of you at the end of my talk here, which may be an option for some of you, and if people can find can somehow, if they're employed as either civil society organization workers at all, or if they're employed as policymakers, or they're employed in any way in the public sector, I have an idea for you if you're interested in these questions. But Katie, keep going. Okay, let's hear your question.
No, I just wanted to say that, for instance, yeah, it takes a while to obtain a residence permit or asylum for refugees. Like it can take not even months, but ages. And this waiting period and it's really horrible. But on the other hand, this long-lasting process is also understandable because there are a lot of people who wanted to take advantage of the crisis in 2015. For instance, I heard that it was in Finland when some Afghani or Syrians, I don't remember quite well, they came to Finland, and after a while they withdrawn their application, arguing that it was too cold and too expensive, and they traveled back. Or for instance, I know a person who is a Syrian, but he came on a plane from Algeria to France or something like that, and then in France he said that I'm a Syrian refugee.
Okay, so there's at least two different points to deal with there. One is, well, thanks for that, Katie. One of the things that reminds me of when I was living in Norway in the early 1990s, there were a group of, I believe they were from Iran, of Iranian refugees living in the very north of Norway above the Arctic Circle, who were planning on suing the Norwegian state for violation of their human rights because it was too cold up north. You know, so that's, I think it's a really creative strategy, and I'm not making fun of it. I think, you know, wow, I should have thought of that myself. Now, you know, we obviously are going to find these individual cases of people who withdraw their applications for different reasons. And I think that what we have to do here is we have to try to bear in mind that when we have these individuals who decide to withdraw their application for what looks like reasons of convenience, we can't take those cases, those handful of cases, and use that to generalize about the experiences of the large number of individuals who come to the country. Do those things happen? Yes. Are they great anecdotes? You know, they're fantastic anecdotes. You know, I love them as anecdotes, but are they more than anecdotes? There I would be suspicious. Then I want to get to Katie's other point, which is about this idea of individuals who arrive by plane as opposed to doing the oversea and overland route. If we think of why it is that people have to get on a little rubber boat and cross dangerous waters and climb through mountains and walk through the Western Balkans and try to make it then, you know, on and on and on and across Germany and up into Denmark and then into Sweden, does that automatically mean they're more desperate than somebody who gets on an airplane? No. What that means is that over time, over the past few decades, states, together with airline companies, have implemented procedures that make it more difficult for individuals who want asylum to arrive. Why do people get in small little boats and cross the water and try to make it to Italy? Because since they lack the documentation necessary to get on the plane, they can't get on the plane and come and ask for asylum. They know that if they can put foot on Swedish soil, they'll ask for asylum, but they can't get on the plane. So if you want to really point fingers, I think where you point fingers are at the people that put them in the risky conditions. And it's not the smugglers, there wouldn't be smugglers if people could get on airplanes and come and ask for asylum. Who makes money off of this? You make it tough for people to fly here, well, then they can get in little boats and cross deserts and do things like that. And that's going to get exploited by unscrupulous individuals who want to take money away from them and don't think about their health. I see we've only got 1 minute left. I know you've got a 20-minute break. I don't know if you've got a final question or whether that's it. Trust me, I can keep
Я
going.
хочу
I know you
дати
can't, so.
можливість задати останнє запитання Олександру, бо він дуже довго тягнув руку. Дякую, Олександре. Тоді останнє запитання буде від вас.
У меня есть вопрос, возвращаюсь к тому вопросу, который у меня к вам был вторым. Есть ли в Швеции организации, которые, возможно, занимаются поиском документов? Все-таки многие документы находятся в онлайн-режиме. Есть ли такая организация? И есть ли у эмигрантов, которые реально имеют образование по своей специальности, пройти какие-нибудь экзамены, которые подтвердят, что у них есть те знания, которые необходимы для работы?
Number one, you've just hit on a fascinating idea. You've just hit on something that could be a really, really interesting plan, because we don't have one centralized organization that works with individuals in terms of all of their document replacement needs. And so if we oftentimes think of public administration, when public administration does good work, a lot of times it's these one-stop shops that help people with all of these different services concentrated together. This type of assistance would be fantastic. Whether it's feasible, I'm not sure, but I love it as an idea. And so if I love it as an idea, well, then you just figure it out. So there's that. But what we do have is certainly not helping people find the documents, but verify the documents would be the University and High School, University and College Council assists with that. And then, of course, different organizations at the volunteer level are going to try to lend support to greater or lesser extents. But no, there's nothing centralized. And that makes it absolutely worthwhile considering, again, how could we be better at that next time? If people lack documentation, how do we assist them in relocating their documentation? And we ought to be keeping a short list as a country of what it is we didn't get right and how we could do it better.